History remembers the Roman legion as an unstoppable machine, a heavily armored, highly disciplined wall of iron and wood that conquered the known world. From the forests of Gaul to the deserts of North Africa. To stand in front of 40,000 advancing Romans was a death sentence. But in the year 53 BC, the invincible Roman war machine marched into the Syrian desert and met an enemy that didn't play by their rules. They were expecting a glorious, easy conquest. Instead, they walked into a slaughterhouse. By the time the sun set on the plains of Carrhae, over 20,000 Romans lay dead. Another 10,000 were captured, and the severed head of Rome's wealthiest man was being used as a prop in a theater play. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a complete psychological dismantling of the Roman Empire, and it was executed by an army a quarter of their size. To understand how Rome walked into this nightmare, you have to understand the ego of one man, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was arguably the richest man in the history of Rome. He made his fortune through ruthless real estate speculation, even running a private fire brigade that would only put out burning buildings if the desperate owners agreed to sell their property to him for pennies. He had the money to buy anything he wanted. But in the Roman Republic, wealth was only half the equation. You needed military glory. Crassus was part of the first triumvirate, the three-headed monster that ruled the Republic. The other two heads were Pompey the Great, who had conquered the East, and Julius Caesar, who was currently becoming a living god by slaughtering his way through Gaul. Crassus was in his 60s. He had wealth, but his military resume was limited to crushing a slave rebellion led by Spartacus years earlier. To him, that wasn't enough. He looked at the map, pointed east to the Parthian Empire, stretching across modern-day Iran and Iraq, and saw his ticket to eternal glory. The Parthians were a relatively new superpower, nomadic horsemen from the Asian steppes, who had overthrown the successors of Alexander the Great. The Romans viewed them as uncultured barbarians. Crassus assumed they would scatter the moment Roman sandals hit their dirt. In 53 BC, without a formal declaration of war and ignoring the furious protests of the Roman Senate, Crassus crossed the Euphrates River into Parthian territory. He brought with him 7 legions, around 35,000 heavy infantry, plus 4,000 light troops and 4,000 cavalry. It was an army of absolute devastation. Crassus's officers advised him to follow the river. The Euphrates would provide water, protect their flanks, and offer a clear path to the Parthian capital. But Crassus was in a hurry. He wanted to catch the enemy off guard. So, when a local Arab chieftain named Ariamnes rode into the Roman camp and offered to guide them straight through the desert to intercept a retreating Parthian force, Crassus agreed. What Crassus didn't know was that Ariamnes was a spy. He was working directly for the Parthian commander. For days, the Roman army marched away from the river, deep into the arid, baking wasteland of the Mesopotamian desert. The heat was suffocating. The legionnaires marched in woolen tunics carrying up to 60 pounds of gear, weapons, and rations. The dust choked them. Water quickly ran low. The men grew exhausted, their morale baking away under the relentless sun. Then, the scouts came galloping back in a panic. The enemy wasn't retreating. They were here. Crassus expected a sprawling, disorganized barbarian horde. But the Parthian king hadn't even bothered to send his main army. He had sent a 30-year-old brilliant general from a noble family named Surena. Surena had brought just 10,000 men against 40,000 Romans. As the Romans hastily formed up their battle lines near the town of Carrhae, the desert ahead seemed eerily empty. Then, the sound began. The Romans were used to the blast of trumpets or the screaming war cries of Celtic tribes. But the Parthians didn't scream. Instead, from the dust clouds came the deep, resonant booming of massive hollow kettle drums, wrapped in bronze and covered with leather. The sound was deafening, a slow, low-frequency thundering that seemed to shake the ground and rattle the bones of the tired legionnaires. The psychological warfare had begun. Then the Parthian vanguard came into view. The Romans breathed a sigh of relief. Through the dust, they saw riders wearing coarse animal skins and rough cloaks. It looked exactly like the disorganized, unarmored mob they had expected. The Roman line braced for the charge, but just as the Parthians closed the distance, Serena gave a signal. In unison, the Parthian riders threw off their rough cloaks. Beneath them, blinding sunlight reflected off thousands of interlocking plates of polished steel and bronze. This was Rome's terrifying introduction to the cataphract. The riders and their enormous horses were completely covered in scale mail armor, transforming them into living iron battering rams. They carried heavy two-handed lances called contos, designed to skewer 2 men at once. Crassus ordered his men to hold the line, expecting the heavy cavalry to smash into their shields. But the cataphracts didn't charge. They simply pulled back and held their position, acting as an impenetrable wall. Instead, the other 9,000 Parthian riders swept out from the wings. These were the light horse archers. They didn't wear heavy armor, they didn't carry swords. They carried the most advanced piece of military technology in the ancient world, the composite recurve bow. Made of layered wood, horn, and sinew, the Parthian bow had a draw weight that could snap a man's arm. It fired heavy arrows with incredible velocity, topped with narrow, armor-piercing iron heads. The horse archers formed a massive, swirling circle around the Roman army. They didn't engage in hand-to-hand combat, they just started shooting. The sky went dark. A relentless, hissing rain of iron poured down on the trapped legionnaires. Crassus ordered his men to form the testudo, the famous tortoise formation. The Romans locked their massive rectangular shields together, creating a roof of wood and leather over their heads. Against Celtic slings or standard arrows, the testudo was practically invincible, but not against the composite bow. The heavy Parthian arrows struck with such kinetic force that they punched clean through the wood, pinning the soldiers' hands to their own shields. When the Romans broke the formation to pull the arrows out, the archers would aim for their exposed legs and faces. Panic began to ripple through the Roman ranks. Men were dying by the hundreds without ever swinging their swords. But Roman discipline held. The centurions yelled to their men to stay calm. They knew a basic law of ancient warfare. An archer only carries about 30 arrows. The Romans just had to wait. Eventually, the Parthians would run out of ammunition, and then they would be forced to retreat or fight in close combat. But Serena had rewritten the laws of war. As the Romans watched from behind their splintering shields, they saw something that broke their spirit entirely. Behind the swirling circle of archers stood a massive train of 1,000 Arabian camels, and strapped to the back of every single camel were hundreds of quivers packed with fresh arrows. The arrows were never going to stop. Desperation took hold. Crassus ordered his son Publius, a brave and highly decorated cavalry commander who had fought alongside Caesar, to break out. Publius took 1,000 elite Gallic cavalry, several hundred archers and heavy infantry, and charged the Parthian lines. The horse archers immediately broke away and retreated. Publius, thinking he had routed them, chased them deep into the desert, away from the main Roman army. It was a feigned retreat, another classic step tactic. As Publius's men galloped blindly through the dust, the Parthian archers executed the move that would make them immortal. Without slowing their horses, they twisted their bodies entirely backwards in the saddle and fired perfectly aimed shots right into the faces of the pursuing Romans. This was the legendary Parthian shot. Publius was lured directly into the waiting wall of heavily armored cataphracts. His light Gallic cavalry tried to fight, even pulling the Parthian lances from their horses, but it was useless. Publius and his entire detachment were slaughtered. Back at the main camp, Crassus was anxiously waiting for news of his son. He believed the charge had worked because the barrage of arrows had temporarily stopped. Then, he heard the drums again. The Parthians rode back over the ridge, but this time they had a trophy. A single rider trotted up to the Roman lines, carrying a spear. Impaled on the tip was the severed head of Publius Crassus. The psychological blow was absolute. The Romans realized there was no escape. The slaughter resumed and continued until nightfall, when the Parthians finally withdrew to their camp, refusing to fight in the dark. Under the cover of night, Crassus, completely broken by the death of his son and the destruction of his army, abandoned his wounded men. Their screams echoed across the desert as the remnants of the Roman army fled to the nearby walled town of Carrhae. But they were trapped. The next day, Serena arrived at the walls and offered terms of peace. Crassus, terrified, refused to go, but his own mutinous soldiers threatened to kill him if he didn't negotiate. Crassus rode out to meet Serena. It was a setup. A scuffle broke out and Crassus was pulled from his horse and killed. What happened next became legendary. According to history, the Parthians, knowing of Crassus's insatiable legendary greed, poured molten gold down his severed throat, declaring that his thirst for wealth had finally been quenched. But the final insult was yet to come. The severed head of Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, was sent back to the Parthian king. At that exact moment, the king was attending a performance of the Greek tragedy, the Bacchae. During the play's climax, an actor is supposed to carry a fake severed head onto the stage. Instead, the actor walked out holding the real, rotting head of the Roman triumvir. The audience erupted in applause. The Battle of Carrhae wasn't just a defeat, it was a message. Rome had met a power that looked it straight in the eye, absorbed its best blow, and shattered it to pieces. The myth of Roman invincibility was broken forever.